All right. Welcome back to the second session of the day. I think the next two speakers hardly need any introduction. Benji and Ollie, everybody knows them, I think. Otherwise, I'm pretty sure they'll tell us a little bit about themselves in their talk. Let's get started. Woo.
Test, test.
Yeah, it's working.
Perfect.
Tell us a bit about yourself, Ollie.
Yes, hi, good morning. I'm Oliver Harder. I do basically research and development, some security stuff, so probably you know me from my yesterday's talks. I'm showing security issues that actually don't work in a presentation, so that's these kind of things I do. And besides that, I have a passion for, or somehow a passion for domain-driven design, event sourcing, and these kind of things. Yeah.
Cool. So I'm Benji, for those who don't know me. I'm developer advocate at the TYPO3 GmbH, consultant, UI UX lead, and I have actually no idea about domain-driven design. So glad, Ollie, I got you on my side so you can explain me what I always do wrong. So for this is also, our presentation is a bit split in two parts. One part will be done by Oliver that will give you a broad introduction about Exbase, how it's been working, about persistence and variations, and software architecture in general. And then we will do some caching examples, how you can speed up your applications and, well, get it faster where you made it slow before, and some bonus stuff. So, I guess your part, Ollie.
Yes, so thank you. Yeah, there's a lot of things that we could tell about Exbase. However, these 45 minutes are probably not enough to tackle each of the problems. So let's first start with Exbase in a nutshell. So a short recap, I guess most of you have been working with Exbase already. So what I do a lot, or what I like doing, is like having these kind of models or these kind of visual representation. Does that thing actually has a pointer, a laser pointer?
Yes, but it's not installed, the software. So
it's not installed. Okay, that's cool. That's too advanced for me. So what we can see here is basically the Exbase layer, and on the left side we have these kind of layers that basically we know. We have an application layer, infrastructure layer, which is like communicating with the database, a domain layer, which is pretty familiar, and the presentation layer, sending back data to your user, actually. And on the right side, I tried to come up with some ideas what kind of technologies or techniques might be used in each of these layers. So let's first start with the routing. Yeah, basically you have a request that goes bottom up, that is handled by TYPO3 or by the Exbase routing, and then we enter the application layer, which basically the controller takes a famous and enormous part in dispatching all these requests and all that information to the accordant parts. Then we have the repository layer, because you have to store these kind of things somewhere in a database or in a service and have to retrieve them from somewhere. And then in the end you create domain models, and these domain models basically should contain, if you read books about domain-driven design, that should contain your business logic. So actually all the stuff, all the processings, all the behavior should be modeled in business logic, and probably we will see that in Exbase applications that's a bit different. So at least from these Exbase applications that we know, most of these parts are centered in the controller part or in service layers. Yeah. So what I wanted to show here is basically that the domain model is a very important part if we talk about Exbase, and the domain model is basically available everywhere in all of these layers. Okay. Okay, I have to click everything. There are security aspects, so I have to look up what I want to say. Yeah, security aspects in Exbase. Basically, Exbase does not have a security layer as you know it from the backend. Yeah, so you cannot configure like this role or this user group has access to a particular combination of a controller and the action. You have to take care about that on your own. And some of the Exbase applications that we see or that are available basically on GitHub do that in a way. We will come to that later. However, it really is required that your application basically takes care of that. Yeah. So that's what I just said, because you can directly call a controller and action combination. Yeah, like for instance, everybody is able to show a list of items, but in the end, if you have not coded your application correctly, you could directly call the delete action, giving a UID, and then, yeah, a record, an item is deleted. So you really have to take care about that in your custom implementation controllers. Yeah, so that means access control must be done individually. So either you use a dedicated plugin for that, and we have an example for that later on, using front-end groups and dedicated plugins, or you do that in the controller action. So just to be aware of that, you know, I want to focus more on these security aspects. And here is an example which just addresses the view part. So this is a fluid representation, and here it checks whether the currently logged in front-end user belongs to the group mechanic. And if that is true, then you get a button shown. However, even if that button is not there, you can still call that action, probably directly if you have not. Okay, let's talk a little bit about persistence. So I guess that's true for some of you, yeah, so that you start creating a new Exbase extension by using the extension builder. So just a short poll, who's using the extension builder for kickstarting Exbase applications? Okay, next question, who is doing that from scratch? So, okay, I would not have expected that. So that's a false assumption on my side. Okay, so some of you are using the extension builder, which is good for getting started. However, and that's what I think the majority of you, of the audience, is doing, you have to adjust that, or you have to even consider rewriting or writing that from scratch, because you have to really take care about what your application is about. So that's the first part. And as I mentioned, I like these kind of models, so a huge model, but the thing that you should focus on is a car. So what I'm going to present here is an example that's about cars, and you can rent these cars, and there are a couple of individuals and objects and, yeah, services involved in that car. And I just want to show that this is a really huge model. Maybe your application has more larger models that involve more objects that are bound to one object. So on the aggregate root part, we will come later. So if that is created, you basically have something like this as a model. So you still have that huge model having all of these properties. So like, I don't want to focus much on the scalar types that just have an integer value or a string value. But the important part here is that you have these kind of relationships to other models. Like here we have a charge, or we have the 4 tires, for instance, and that all is bound to that one car object. So it's really a huge, fat model. Everything is available at once. However, that also has a drawback if you want to retrieve that from the storage, from your repositories. How can you overcome that? So Exbase offers possibilities in order to retrieve that. So you can use lazy loading on that. So you don't have to retrieve everything of these all of the properties, but you can retrieve, for instance, the tires when you need them, when you access them, and when you want to show these tires. And then lazy loading also applies to single objects, for instance. So this is probably how that might look like. So I'm skimming quickly over the persistence part because Benji also has some topics later on. So this is the brand model, which is using the lazy load persistence. Does not in that view. So we would have a lazy load annotation. However, the get branch method would either act as lazy loading, or if that is replaced, directly return the object that represents the brand name, like Audi or BMW.
I could have built that in for you if you have told me that you wanted to show the lazy loading.
Yeah, sure. That I forgot to tell you that, so that was in my initial Anyway, so that's a way that is built in Exbase, so you can use lazy loading for that in order to reduce the amount of queries that are executed at once. I guess you heard about that already, because you want to improve the performance of your whole application. Besides that, you also have the possibility to use the Doctrine DBAL query builder directly. So you don't have to rely on the query builder that is built into Exbase, but you can use the common technique that is used in the core DBAL directly and can use your own query statements. And what's the important part here? If you use your own query statements using custom joins and using custom queries in order to be more flexible, of course you have to take care about escaping these values, especially if they come from an outside world, so if they're user submitted, because otherwise you would again run into security issues. And it's very simple not to think about these things, like for instance, if we talk about like statements and these kind of things. Okay. Yes, so that's the one part. The second part, lazy loading, we had using a Doctrine query builder to retrieve the data. And also, Exbase provides that object-relational mapping. Yeah, so that is records that are persisted in a database are mapped to an object. So that's your model representation. And Exbase is doing that for you automatically. So you're using a repository, and you issue a query like show all cars, and then you get an array of objects that are reconstituted into cars. And of course, that takes time. Yeah, because it's calculation, it has to do the reflection stuff on the PHP side. And in order to avoid that, you can directly omit the ORM layer and retrieve raw data. That means you get back arrays, yeah? So you don't get back objects in a way.
But Ollie, please let me interrupt you for a moment.
Okay.
But the ORM part is not specifically only for Exbase, right? So that problem that we have, that when we don't split or do something else about lazy loading with our queries we're firing to the query builder is, well, the same for Symfony or Laravel or whatever, right?
Yeah, that's right.
A software design of ORM itself.
So object-relational mapping solves a lot for you. So if you, I don't want to say lazy, but you want to be have a comfortable way in implementing your application. So as we have seen some slides earlier, so if you want to get everything in one container, then basically you're good using the ORM layer. If you're using the raw array data, then you have to know very much about your application. And basically it's the same in Laravel, Symfony, and all these frameworks. So it's not only related to Exbase, of course. Okay, so that was a quick run through the persistence layer part. And if you're not yet confused, then probably you will get with the software architecture part, where I try to show you some concepts of how you could separate your models a bit more. So let's have a look again into the example. So again, here there's the aggregate root part, and aggregate root basically means, I guess you know that you have one centric item, one object that you have to access in order to retrieve, for instance, the rentals or the maintenance part. So you cannot directly retrieve the maintenance part. If you were able to do that, that would be an aggregate root as well. So if you're using the query builder, you have that check mark where you can select, okay, that's an aggregate root. So here we have one centric entry point in order to retrieve all the data. And as you can see here, we have a lot of relationships, and even more, the rental part is linked to a customer, an agent, a mechanic, and these roles, these entities here, using single table inheritance, so they inherit from an employee, and that inherits from a front-end user. So it's perfect. So when you retrieve a car, you get a lot of data from your database, a lot of query and a lot of memory consumption. And the question is, how can we improve that? So that's the initial example. Output in Fluid, and as you can see there, a lot of data, everything is available. It's quite flexible to use that in your view. You don't have to think much about what is available, because everything is available. So here are the pros and cons again. So you have that aggregate root, everything available, a single entry point, and it's very comfortable to use that technique in your application, in your view. However, that also means that you have a lot of database queries, memory footprint is high, and probably if you have a lot of like 10,000 of records or items, you have a really performance impact that you have to tackle. And of course, that is growing.
A problem, right? So
yeah, it's like a problem. Yeah, like it takes like 10 seconds until your list of whatever cars is loaded. So the idea here is to separate these into different contexts and scenarios. So for instance, on the one hand, we have one scenario that is just for renting a car, which I call the rental context. So when you rent a car, the mechanic does not need to know about the state of the tires and when the last maintenance was. So that's just not important. So the important here is the car available and where is the car? So that's the rental context on the one side. So presenting the cars, handling the reservation and the rentals, and basically handle the booking and the pricing. And on the other side, that's the next context that we set on the same level is the maintenance context, which is about maintaining a car, checking the tires, the brakes, is the engine working, and these kind of things what a mechanic is doing, and also document these kind of actions. So I like pictures, and here, as you can see, we had that one car, that big car, and now it's separated into these two sides. So on the left side, we have the rental part, which just affects the rental topic, as I mentioned, and on the right side you have that maintenance part. And here in the center part we have some common thing, like there's a brand name which cannot be declared to be either related to the rental part or the maintenance part only. But by using that technique, we limit the complexity of our model because we really target and focus the application to what actually is represented in the front end or represented to our user. So basic concept of using bounded contexts in an Exbase environment. And basically, using a context means that we introduce another part in the namespace. So it's here, and then we have another maintenance section, and of course, we also have a rental section. So we have to adjust the repository part as well, and the configuration for that. Yes. So it looks like that. And in order to get that working, you have to do mapping because Exbase does not support that out of the box. So Exbase has a very strict naming conventions of using a name for a model, and then you get the controller name, and then you automatically can retrieve the repository name. And in order to tell Exbase where to find that information, you have to configure that by using TYPOscript. Okay, that works. So that's the result actually, and if you look carefully to that, we have the rental car, and in the rental car we just have the rentals, but not the maintenances anymore, yeah, because that's separated now. Next part is about inheritance. So as I have mentioned earlier, there's an agent which extends an employee object, which extends from front-end user. That means that basically in your view, you also would have the username and the password available. So you could use them, but probably for your rental application, you don't need them in your view. And the idea here is to get rid of that, because basically there's too much superfluous information that is put to your view and that is available in your application. So basically we only need the customer ID and the employee ID, and everything else we can just forget about that. So the full front-end user is just used for authentication, and that happens much earlier and not anymore in our Exbase application. So basically that looks like that in order to get rid of the front-end user part. So we removed that single table inheritance, and if we really need it, we use a front-end user service in order to retrieve the front-end object. So that's another way to split away information that we had built up out of just being comfortable in using that application, split that away and use it or require it if we really need it in our application. And in most times we don't need it. Okay, so that was the part about single table inheritance, getting away that information. And there's another part which is about using the Exbase plugin configuration. Because a plugin should only contain the required controller action parts. And you can even use that for a basic permission control. So what we can see here is 4 plugin configurations. So the first is the information. I try that again. The first is the information plugin, which just is showing the list of available cars. So that's basically a customer that has not logged in into the application. The next section is the checkout part. And in order to do a checkout booking, you probably need to have an account and valid account on that website. So you have to be logged in. And then we have 2 other parts, which is management. Let's like a agent is using the management controller, and we have the maintenance part, which is used by the maintainers or the mechanics. So does that help? Yeah, probably yes, because then you can use a dedicated plugin that is used for a scope or for a user group and assign the access permission by using TYPO3 or by using these access permissions. On the other side, if you would have a plugin that has the control or the ability to load every controller and every action, then that's what I showed initially. You can directly call these action controller pairs, which might end up in having a security issue. So that was my rundown on the short domain-driven design part, and there's much more that we could tell about that. What I want to say is it really depends on your application. Yeah, it's not like that we can say, do it exactly that way. It really depends on how much data you have to deal with, how large the objects will be, how many items you are, and then in the end you have to do that kind of analyzing your domain model and do a profiling on your own in order to get to a comfortable and performance situation. And this afternoon there's a talk done by Benny Mack about performance improvements using Blackfire.io, and I think that also would be interesting. And now I hand over to Benji.
Okay, but let's summarize that for me so I can understand what you just told me, because I have usually no idea about this. So that means that Exbase by default is not slow as everyone always proposed that it is, right? It really depends on what I'm doing with my domain models, and it only gets slow if I'm more and more putting data and relations and putting a really hard workload on the ORM to fetch the data, right?
Yeah, so if you have a large application, of course, if you want to have the comfort and the joy of development and don't want to think about the internal details about the thing, yeah, of course.
But that also means we had a situation where we were in Berlin and one guy approached us and said, okay, my application is really, really, really slow. And I got only 100 records. And I sat together with Alex Schnitzer and we said, it's not a problem for Exbase, so it can handle it pretty easily. And then it turned out, okay, but he had like 250 relations stored to each of these objects, and they get nested really deep. So that's probably the case where I should consider bounded context, or at least lazy loading, right?
Yeah, rethink the application layer, bounded context, and probably have a look into your domain layer. And what I have shown here with these kind of UML diagrams, if you have a really large UML diagram that does not fit on a screen anymore, or you have to explain too much, then basically you should reconsider all these relationships between them.
Okay, so I now should starting learning UML so I can do this diagram,
yes.
So I know when to start splitting.
You should know that visualization is always a good thing.
Okay, cool. So for visualization, we brought up the next topic that's a usual typical case. So I thought, what would be the best idea? I have clients, or had clients before joining the GmbH, and one of the most requests was, we want to have a weather plugin on our website. Whoever want to have clients weather plugins on the websites? Yeah, some of you are feeling me. So, and I learned stuff the hard way, and I want to join me with what I actually did really wrong. So the first thing about weather is It needs to be the current weather, otherwise it does not provide benefit. It needs to be that minute. It needs to be, I cannot cache this. It needs to be uncached because, yeah, this slide is probably cached. You notice that. So that's not a TYPO3 running in the background that could handle this. But if we now imagine we would have built this in TYPO3, we will probably do something like this. So we get some kind of Extbase plugin and configure it, and we only got one action, and that should be uncached. Yeah? Because we always need the weather now. So, and we now also build a little controller for this that is our current action and thus, well, pushes the data to our view. As you can see, I've learned something over the years, so I've built an open weather map service, and we're now looking into how this actually works, because this is what will be done every time. So it's really pretty easy. Open weather API, weather map API, really easy to use. I just have to do some parameters, do the request to the external service, and I get the data every time fresh. Cool idea for the external endpoint. So let's see what we could possibly just done wrong. So we started to fetching the data from an external endpoint for each request. That could lead us to new problems, because we probably have some of API limits on the other side that will probably cost us a lot of money in the end, because we have to pay for each request. As potential bonus, it's really slow. The question is, how often does the weather actually change? Or maybe we could, well, store the current state of the weather outside for at least some minutes. And we can really make this pretty easy to cache the data with the using of the caching framework. And I'm just now showing you only what actually changed to the original code. And you see that's really, really easy to implement. And we see the conclusion. So for our case, we are configuring a new key for the caching framework, and just use the variable front. Whoops. The variable frontend, and for our case, it's now okay if we just store the data in the database, as long as it's our local database. So they can fetch the data from there. The next thing we need to do is probably in our servers, we need to somehow get the cache manager for this, so we can store and retrieve data from the cache instead at a later point. And if we now have a look at our method again, we actually did not change a lot. So the only thing we did is we calculate somehow a caching identifier, and we just using the parameters we're putting in anyways, since it can be configurable. Checking it again, the caching lifetime, checking, okay, do we still have a valid cache key? Otherwise, we would just fetch the data again, and then, well, Andreas told me I don't need to do the else stuff at the end, and I could just do a return, but I ignored him because I was too lazy to follow new slides. Yeah, so that's pretty easy. This is really minimum effort, high impact. The system only fetches new data after the lifetime is expired from the external endpoint. We drastically limit the request to the external API. That makes it probably a lot cheaper. The bonus, it's faster, and 30 minutes for current weather should be fine. Even we disagree on that. We now, I guess I said 1 hour is enough. Susie said 30 minutes. Benny now said no, it needs to be 15 minutes. I don't know when we ending up at 1 minute, but if you have high traffic to your website, even storing the cache for 1 minute could save you a lot of bucks in the end, right? So the caching framework is really easy to use. If you have a lot of requests for the same data and you cannot do a full page cache or something else, you should consider preparing the data once and store it for a while, right? Keep in mind that cache can have a lifetime. it does not have to be, you don't need to configure a lifetime, then it will be valid until you invalidate the cache. You need to do it yourself, but it's pretty easy, right? Next step is a personal journey I've taken. It's shipping forms to the unknown. What could that be? So, as you may know, we from the GmbH released a block extension, and I had a problem building it into my own website. And the problem was my markup quietly differentiated from that markup that for the comments in the block section were provided by the block extension. So I needed to, and everyone who has built form templates in the past, who had fun with it? Oh. So that's not fun. You want to do it once and you don't want to care about this. So if we take a look where we were coming from. So we shipped the form template as a whole. We got flash message templates, error message templates, and the bonus was we were too lazy to build in on-place validation errors at the properties. Yeah, not so cool. The biggest problem actually we had is that we really could not change these templates because every change to these templates will break someone's front end on update. That means even you may have seen this when I'm starting commenting on Gerrit for small CSS front-end bug fixes. Yeah, well, someone's bug fix is someone else's feature, so it's hard to decide when to roll this or not. So we needed to a new approach to, well, solve our problem in the end. So we made some requirements. So our new form for submitting comments need obviously to validate the input in some way. We need to show the validation errors on the property finally. It needs to persist the data. Would be a shame if it was lost afterwards, except we could send some trolls somewhere else. Everything needs to be translatable so it can be really utilized in every language and would be easy to translate. We need to build the forms dynamically because we also have stuff like Google Capture in that only, well, needs to be included in the form if it's configured properly. Otherwise, it will just throw up errors and nobody would be happy with that. Well, we need to have a possibility to add new features through configuration in the future without destroying the user's front-end interface. It needs to send notifications, it needs to be extendable in the future, and it needs to work in every front-end environment in the world. It does not matter if it's Bootstrap 3, 4, Foundation, I don't know, Tailwind, CSS, whoever is now the fancy front-end framework. Our forms need to work in this. So we made some considerations, and well, we came to the conclusion that the user actually, well, built the forms for us, because we at some point introduced Xform, and most of the people have their contact forms or whatever for the users already defined. So why should I need to do it, right? So we did some pros and cons to see, okay, if that would work for us, and we said, okay, we need to validate inputs. We can obviously do this with Exbase. Form has also built-in validations. Validation on property in Exbase, you need to build this custom. I know whoever done this is quite some hassle with templates. Xform has this already built in. We need to persist data. This is an Exbase optional. You don't have to persist anything. The same is for form. It needs to be translatable. Of course, I can translate everything in Exbase. Of course, I can translate everything in form. Dynamically generated forms in Exbase are not that easy. So I considered it more hard. Well, actually, it's pretty easy in form, and I'll show you later how it's being done. Notifications are custom, so we don't take this into account. We need an extendable API for users to extend this at a later point. Really hard to achieve in Exbase. Well, pretty easy in form. I also will show that. Front-end independent, no, because I ship templates, and at this point I've just lost. With form, I don't ship any templates, and I take the templates the user already has applied. Then the point, I need to build templates, yes. For form, probably not, because someone already did it for us. So the result is pretty easy for us, so we decided, okay, we will go that road, or at least try it out. And this is what we ended up with. So we got an entry point because we also have support for discuss and all that kind of stuff. That's up front, and then we have variations that being rendered depending on the condition right now. So we get local, close, and discuss, but we only want to take a deeper look at the local part. And as you can see, there's a form view helper in there with a factory class, and this is what we're going to have a look at. That means form factory on form finisher in our own extensions. And I will probably not go into the finisher in much detail because some of you already done it or can figure out. We got all the examples in the block extension in current master running. So I will just show you around with the, yeah, pretty hard to read, right? Sorry about that, maybe we should zoom in a bit. So we will go step by step so I can explain you what it's actually doing and why it helps us. So the form factory itself, I've grayed out all the kind of stuff because it's not important. You can provide a prototype that's more or less the general configuration you apply to your form framework. For those who never used it, just use standard, you're fine. We get some object manager, get some form configuration, build a new prototype, and this is the first thing where we're dynamically extending the current existing form implementation for the users. Because what we are now doing, we are registering a new element that's called Google Capture. Yeah? That does not exist in the user's form configuration, we just append it at this point. And we will see how this will turn out later. So in the next step, more or less, we are doing normal Exbase stuff like we used to. We're getting all the TypoScript configuration from our form, so we see what our user has configured. And we will save in a capture array all the stuff that we probably need to check later, like if the capture should be used, or the side key or the secret for validation later. The next point would be, well, we create an imaginal form, the post command form. We tell the controller it should post for, so it's in form, it's the form controller. As you can see, we're using for the submit buttons, all that kind of stuff, we're using the normal localization, translation stuff you use from Exbase, and telling it should take the keys from our block extension. And then we also, well, we got a new we're shipping a new element, the Google Capture element, and we tell the form also, okay, please look at our templates in addition to your already existing configuration without touching the configuration at all. Well, that's for the setup part. The next part is, well, we create a page. And what we are now seeing, someone familiar with Symfony Form Builder, something similar? Okay, so you will be very happy because it more or less looks the same. So what we now here have is just one example how to create a new field, then dynamically. And as you can see, this field has only been added with a condition. That only means if someone has enabled the capture, a side key exists and a secret exists, otherwise this field is not added to the page at all. There are normal examples up front, or we'll share later where you can find the full implementation, so you can look it up for yourself. And we can also add dynamically validators here, like the Google Capture validator. That's pretty neat. So, and well, basically, we also configure our finishers. And after everything went fine and the finisher said, yay, it could be persisted, no errors, well, we just do a redirect to the same page we were coming from, because we know where we're coming from. But we also could get it from some kind of configuration or something else. Well, and then we just tell the form, it's being done, render the form. Phew. Works in every system. We don't have to care about anything. Pretty easy, right? You can look up this example in the block extension. You will find it in the current master branch. Well, it's not less code. It's actually more code. We added more lines of code than we deleted, but we have reached a point of huge customization where we don't need to take care of anymore. Because if you use Foundation, that's fine. I don't like it. But if you like it and configured your form to use Foundation, you don't need to touch the block form templates anymore. Right? So these are the little things we wanted to show you. If you have questions, now is the right time. And we still got 5 minutes.
Are there questions? Anyone? Don't be shy. Ooh.
That's good that you have questions, because otherwise I stop talking again.
Well, I really like your example with the weather extension, that you just use the caching framework to store the data locally. However, in reality, this is a little bit more complex, because you have to consider what is if the open weather server is not available. And you invalidate your cache, no new data is coming, you get a 30-second network timeout, and then you have no data. So in theory, you have to do a little bit more complex logic to do that.
That's totally right. But if I totally agree. And normally you would, after 15 minutes of cache lifetime, you would say, hi, have you no data from me? Okay, you're not talking to me. Okay, I will keep my cache. And you will invalidate yourself, but that would make the example more complex. Well, but yes, you are totally right. We also talked about this. I said, okay, I will not explain that now, because then we will do a complete talk about the caching framework, caching text, invalidation, all that kind of stuff. But I just thought, okay, this may be a good introduction to caching framework, easy way to start. For simple caching, well, after I've been done, I came to the same conclusion, and I said, okay, maybe I should have taken another example for this. But I had no time anymore.
For the real application, then you just take the Weather2 extension, and that does it all for you.
Perfect.
So actually, you would basically use something like a queuing mechanism. So if you in the background, you try to refetch that information, and if the upgrade information fails, then you have a failure queue that is tried not after 15 minutes, but after 1 minute. And if the data is retrieved, then you remove the cache, because then it's like, okay, you have 30 minutes of outdated weather data, but who cares? Because it got 1 degree colder, for instance, so it does not matter in the end. It's somehow eventual consistency. Like, at a point, it gets consistent and up to date.
Well, we have to consider, if we take this weather example, we are not the International Weather Station, and no one will die if our weather is 1 degree slower or lower. So no people will get hurt, no animals killed.
On that happy note, are there any more questions? All right. Then I'd like to remind you to vote for the talks. Throw your little green pieces of paper into the bowl, or whatever other color you might come up with.
I have one last sentence on that.
Yes, please.
But first, finish.
Yes, and then we'll be back here at 11:15 for the next session. In the meantime, enjoy a coffee, and as soon as he's ready with his last sentence, another huge round of applause, right?
Yeah, the basic thing that you have seen in Benji's examples in the end is like, we always talk about reusable components. And I think that the form example really showed how you can reuse a component that already exists in a different context or for a specific context and still having the flexibility to make it your own. So that's it, what it's all about. Thank you.
Applause.
Merci.